Tiësto's fourth album from 2009, Kaleidoscope, it's not good. I mean, why beat around the bush? I've been heavily hinting at my opinions on this project basically any time I've talked about Tiësto in the past. And yeah, this one is gonna be a historic low scorer. I really freaking hate this project, and it's no secret. I'm not even going to be playing any music from this one in the background. I'll be using my own music instead. Half because I kind of planned on doing that anyway, and half because I've been getting a surprising amount of copyright claims for these Tiësto reviews, and I really don't need that kind of trouble. May end up doing this for the remaining 2 reviews as well, but we'll see. Anyway, let's talk about Kaleidoscope. This project is the ever-iconic sellout move. With this project and his subsequent ones, he'd completely abandoned his trance roots in favor of making trendy, radio-friendly electropop. And I mean completely abandoned trance. He'd become almost entirely unrecognizable as the same artist who made Just Be and Elements of Life. Now, it is worth noting that this in and of itself is not necessarily something I disapprove of. First of all, I've said many times over the years, just because it's a sellout doesn't mean it's bad. Artists can pull off a turn for the more commercial and get it to work, so long as the music is fine for what it is. And you could also argue that at least this project was sort of a risk for Tiësto. Putting out a project like this that's such a massive sonic change of pace is a very easy way to alienate your entire fan base. I personally find it hard to argue that this was that risky a move when this literally just rotely follows the sound of pop music at that time. I mean, this came out in the middle of the club boom and at the height of the Black Eyed Peas era, and there was no shortage of material that sounded just like this at the time. Tiësto is not entering into any completely uncharted territory, just territory uncharted for himself personally. But the club boom was also an era that I do often defend material from, since that was right around the time I first became cognizant of pop music at all. I have a lot of nostalgia for the big hits of that late 2000s, early 2010s era. This, for instance, is an element I'll defend on an otherwise all-around trashy project like David Guetta's One Love. It is a sound that reminds me of when I was in middle school. I was 14 when Kaleidoscope came out. I had no idea who Tiësto was at the time. I probably heard tracks from this project in school playlists without even knowing it. Well, there is one track here that I do have a much more vivid memory from when I was in high school. The track Who Wants to Be Alone was playing in gym class one day, and I'm never gonna forget it because it was clearly playing on some damaged CD that started skipping, and no one ever bothered to fix it for nearly the entire class period while I was doing the usual jogging exercises we had to do. I just heard the last 20 seconds of Who Wants to Be Alone on loop, including like half a second of whatever the next track might have been. It was like a ukulele thing, but it never got far enough to be recognizable before just going to the exact same point 15-20 seconds earlier, again, over and over, for a good 30-40 minutes straight. That is the closest thing I have to a nostalgic childhood memory of anything from this album. That's a great sign for you right off the bat. But like I said, I'm not hardwired to automatically hate all sellout albums or electropop albums. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going against the grain by saying that it's as bad as I think it is. Most people don't hate this album. Even in retrospect, knowing that this project was not a fluke and Tiësto would go on to ditch Walk Up Years and make bland radio pop for the rest of his career. Spoilers. The context that Tiësto never recovered from this certainly doesn't help. I mean, I think everyone can agree that Tiësto is an artist who fell off. He may be the single easiest go-to example of an artist in electronic music who might have been good once, but ditched all his integrity for the sake of making more money. Whatever integrity he had before. I do remember hearing this album for the first time in like 2014, going through his catalog, and while I don't remember liking much of anything about it, I don't know if it was necessarily going to be an all-time low scorer. Maybe might have been like a low 4 or a high 3 at the time. Nowadays, though, I think I would personally give a higher recommendation to David Guetta's Listen than this. That album is similarly derivative and soulless and lacking in redeeming qualities basically across the board. But that one's also fairly short and not abrasive on the ears, save for a few choice moments like Hey Mama. I gave that album a 2.3 out of 10. Buckle up, people. This is gonna get ugly. Lots of strong language inbound. See, the first thing that sticks out about Kaleidoscope is that it is long. It's 74 minutes long, just barely fitting within one CD, and has 17 tracks, most of which are like 4 or 5 minutes. Short enough to feel like pop songs, but long enough to still drag. For an IDM or a techno or just regular trance album, this length might be fine, since, you know, the idea is to have a bunch of really long tracks that let the groove sink in. But for a bland radio pop album, this is way too much. I will say that Tiësto at least has the decency to start with a mostly tolerable track, with a 7-minute title track featuring the lead singer of Sigur Rós, Beyoncé? I don't know how to say it. The vocals on that one are nice and airy, and he does some layering with it for something resembling atmosphere. But even this track, one of the few semi-tolerable cuts, is not very good. First of all, it's basically just a worse version of the Chemical Brothers' Snow. And yeah, it may be true that Further wouldn't come out until the following year, and as such this is not a ripoff. But the resemblance is definitely there just sonically, and the Chemicals definitely did it better. And that's not even one of their better tracks either. In place of squeaky distorted guitars and the much more memorable hook that acts as a great build-up into their track, Escape Velocity, as a great payoff, here we get some super flat electro tones and a plodding grooveless drudge that doesn't really go anywhere for a good 5 minutes. And then in the last 2 minutes, these blaring leads just smash through the mix for the payoff, I guess, and it's just cheesy and ridiculous and does not sound good. At least melodically it's not bad, but it's a little basic and not very catchy, and it got markedly worse with repeat listens. Yeah, I listened to this more than once, God help me. So, yeah, that's one of the very best tracks on the album. An overlong album intro that would have been one of the worst tracks on Elements of Life if it had made that album. Not sure if I like it more than Dance for Life, but that one still sounds better.
After that, it went downhill so fucking quick. It was seriously like a fat kid with weights in his pocket rolling down a hill. It was just like quick. Super fucking quick.
We then follow the title track with Escape Me, which is a little more indicative look at what this album's really all about, and also just one of the most awful, ear-splitting things I've ever heard. Noisy and slapping drums that are barely danceable, soulless synthesized rock guitar stuttering without any bass, obnoxious video game synth bleeping, all of these sounds crashing together in a distorted, clipping, unsightly heap of noise, and to top it all off, the trying so hard to be cool and edgy, throaty yelping of C.C. Sheffield. Escape me! And don't even try telling me, well, at least it was kind of original. No, it fucking wasn't. There's not an original bone in this album's body. And I'm not even talking about other stuff that's done these kinds of sounds light years better, like Cruella's Get Wet and all those. That wasn't until later. Look, you remember when I was blasting Get Us Listen for being a complete ripoff of Avicii's True, an album I already didn't care for much and being done worse in every conceivable way? Very similar deal with Kaleidoscope here. This album also rips off most of its synth tones and general approach to everything from another album that came out 2 years prior, and I shit you not, I'm referring to David Guetta's Pop Life. I've already gone on record as that album being pretty bad all around. I've described it as a big headache and a massively tedious listen. But, and I can't believe I'm saying this, not only did that album have some more punch and weight and groove than this one, Pop Life was also probably the closest Guetta came to having a sound of his own. I mean, Guetta's ripped off other artists' styles for the vast majority of his career, but that whole club boom sound was at least something that he was instrumental in forming. Tiësto, meanwhile, this dude really had the fucking gall to rip off David Guetta. This motherfucker's really making me give David Guetta credit. This is the level we're operating on. The good news is that the album doesn't stay as completely unlistenable as Escape Me for the entire rest of its running time. That is one of the biggest low points. But that's not to say we ever go anywhere good from here. The early stretches of this album is less offensive on a production level, but is mostly just super run-of-the-mill boilerplate electropop that is so incredibly basic to the point of almost being distracting in and of itself. You Are My Diamond with Kiana Alarid, I Am Strong with Priscilla Ahn. These tracks don't hurt my ears, and the latter vocalist is by miles the best sounding guest on the whole album, Priscilla Ahn. She sounds pretty good. But the songs themselves are just brain-rotting and inane and feel totally cynical and focus-grouped and low effort. I mean, much of I Am Strong just focuses on the 4 chords of pop and really makes this track feel even more like Rachel Platten-style faux inspirational crap right down to the title. And the fact that it's the lowest key of all the tracks here does not help. Not something that particularly radiates strength. And the production on this album is just crap across the board. You look at a track like I Will Be Hyuh with a sneaky sound system, which is just noisy and obnoxious and screechy. There's barely any groove or bass there, just these loud blaring leads that poke cookie cutter holes in the mix and pierce through everything else. They sound absolutely fucking terrible. Just inexcusable. Like, even someone like Steve Aoki had the decency to make such leads feel big and imposing. This is just annoying. Now, there is one more track on here that is somewhat tolerable, Here on Earth. The vocals from Carey Brothers, that's one guy and his real name, by the way, they've got some emotion in them. The production is not annoying either, and there's some kind of neat tapping piano moments, even if compositionally this is totally plain and boring festival anthem fodder, and there's nothing here you to remember after 5 minutes. And even during the piano part, I just imagine pissed off Schroeder tapping the same keys over and over. And there's also an outro to this one tacked on, which is trying to pass itself off as its own separate track called Always Near. And I gotta ask, what purpose did that serve? It's basically just a reprise of the song we just heard, but without the vocals or percussion. It's pure filler to pad out the track listing. But yeah, that once again is as good as this album's ever gonna get. We then move on to It's Not the Things You Say, which managed to stand out a lot more in its awfulness. First of all, the singer, Kele Okereke, sorry for butcher pronunciation as per usual, why the hell does he sound like this? He's got this super thick and ridiculous accent, and his voice is yelping like Fetty Wap. And mind you, I've heard what this guy sounds like on other projects aside from this one. He sounded a lot more normal when I previewed through some of his stuff with Block Party and some of his more recent solo stuff. He usually doesn't sound this ridiculous, even with his British accent. And I knew him from his guest appearance on The Chemical Brothers' Believe, and he was freaking great there and fit perfectly. This is almost like an oversold parody of an accent. This is just kind of embarrassing. And that's not even to talk about the instrumental on this one. Jesus Christ, that's much worse. Like, the pianos sound like they're pulled straight out of a car commercial. I can just hear the voiceover about APR financing right there in my head. And the buzzing, wavering organ synths that follow are just so oily and unpleasant and grating, and it's like I got a bunch of mosquitoes in my ears. Just awful. Next up is a pair of tracks that are slightly less awful, but still not very good. I don't mind the idea of having some instrumental cuts like Fresh Fruit in theory to break up the pacing and give the project some more variety, but in practice they don't really add anything but padding out the running time more. A track like this, for instance, is just boring and crappy sounding progressive house without any punch, like if Eric Prydz didn't have any talent. I feel like I've heard tracks like this described as experimental before somewhere, and I don't understand what about a track like Fresh Fruit is experimental in any way beyond the lack of vocals. It sounds just like all the other tracks on here, but instrumental this time. I mean, didn't he and Rogers used to know how to actually put a groove together that felt like it was going somewhere exciting besides generic festival synth plucks and this buzzing farting noise trying to pass itself off as a bass line? But whatever, I guess that's one of the less offensive cuts here. I don't care for it, but I can at least see how someone else might like it. Century with Calvin Harris also is not offensive. It is one of the few tracks here that feels like it has an actual decent bass line and is generally pretty catchy. That said, Calvin Harris's vocals are kinda ridiculous. The way he says, hello, and now put your hands in the air, and make it sound like he's making fun of you for dancing to this, and the track really wears out its welcome by the end. Just another reminder that I'm Not Alone has more punch and groove than anything on this album ever will. Century probably would have been the worst track if it would have been included on Ready for the Weekend. Also, don't get how the AllMusic review calls the putting hands in your air for a Century line humorous? Was that trying to be funny? I couldn't really tell. Not that Calvin Harris's sense of humor has ever done anything for me but ruin his entire first album. But as we go down, the well of suck continues downward. We got Feel It in My Bones and Who Wants to Be Alone, 2 more Escape Me or I Will Be Hyuh type tracks with obnoxious vocals trying to have an attitude and terrible production, the former coming special with the generic 4-chord progression. I don't know if it's exactly the 4 chords the whole time, but it's pretty close. And Who Wants to Be Alone is especially just one of the worst produced tracks in the bunch. Whenever that one comes up, I'm always just kind of shocked at how completely underweight and skittery and dead the instrumental sounds. I don't remember the skipping CD in high school sounding this bad. I guess the reverb at the gym allowed the bass to actually resonate, or maybe it was a remix by someone who sucked less. I don't know. And from there, it only gets worse and worse and worse. LA Ride is another instrumental progressive house cut that sounds like it was thrown together in a half hour. It's so basic and lame and repetitive, and those fucking screechy organ leads being used as crash cymbals are like fucking nails on a chalkboard. I hate listening to something, especially from a big budget name like him, and thinking, Jesus, even I could have done that better. And then there's 3 more tracks co-produced by Dada Life. They also helped with Century. And while these are maybe not as pathetically basic, they're somehow even more excruciating. All the layers of piercing, high-pitched buzzing on Bend It Like You Don't Care sound like you're running dentist drills directly into my ears. Knock You Out completely buries its guest vocalist Emily Haynes in its grating, blasting leads, to the point of her getting totally drowned out and my not being able to understand a single word she says. Not that her singing was all that good to begin with. Hopes. But just why would you mix like this? And the album climaxes quite gloriously with the most obnoxious and ear-bleeding track of them all in Louder Than Boom, which is a complete audio nightmare. Shitty, screechy, pre-big room Morse code drops, percussive chiptune bleeps that grate against the rest of the mix, abrasive synth pads for that extra mix clipping and audio tearing, and another clusterfuck of dentist drill sawtooth buzzing that just makes me want to jump out the window. I mean, at least he's finishing the album going all out, but yeah, that might be the worst track in the bunch. Maybe. There's a lot of competition for that spot. Oh yeah, and there's an ambient outro called Surrounded by Light, and even this track is all abrasive and fuzzy and awful as well, but at least by that point it's just a sign that this grueling torture chamber of an album is finally freaking over. So yeah, that's Kaleidoscope, and it's one of the worst things I've ever listened to. This is kind of the reason I wanted to do this series, this has been a rant that's been built up for a while. Now, to be fair, this album is not completely devoid of redeeming qualities. I at least get the appeal of a project like this if you, for instance, have more nostalgia for this era and sound. Like I said, I'm going against the grain by rating it this low, and most people don't hate it nearly as much as I do. Tiësto and Hyuh seem to know what pacing is, and at least attempted to make a varied listen, even if they didn't fully succeed. And only about half the project made me tense up in pure disgust, the rest was just boring and basic and bland. Not to mention, as historically awful as Kaleidoscope is, I can definitely imagine worse albums than this. I have yet to sit through a full project from Marshmello or Borgore. From what I've heard, they may have potential for some 1 out of 10 material. I don't know how willing I'd actually be to sit through them, though. And of course, since I know the comments about it are coming, this album is still miles above Dave Nolan's The Outsider. Kaleidoscope is at least an album created by humans in hopes of entertaining other humans. The Outsider was probably AI generated and a test to see if you could cheat the iTunes charts or something like that, rather than something actually meant to be listened to. That project's a true 0.0 out of 10 for you, and I don't think it's physically possible to pass below that line. But yeah, the fact that I'm bringing up that project at all in a video like this is really something. I've said before that on average I don't care for Tiësto, and while I'll admit nothing else I've heard from him hits anywhere near the level of pure concentrated awful that this project does, I think this project alone just sunk that average down a lot lower than it would have been otherwise. I haven't actually heard the London sessions yet, but I anticipate that album is just going to be boring and not outright offensive. And it'll at least have Jackie Chan on it, so that'll at least be one genuinely good song. This album's best moments would be among the worst even on other Tiësto albums, just because of how consistently unbearable the production is, and or how lazy and rudimentary the compositions are. I mean, Tiësto was at just a low enough point of respectability before that a single project this bad could completely burn down all the credit he had before, because I mean, it wasn't out of character at all. He was already super commercial, and it wasn't that big a shock to see him sell out so hard. I mean, he's a commercial trance artist, all of them have to do that at least once. But Tiësto also had just enough cred before for sheer disappointment to also factor in and sink this even lower. I mean, this is just a perfect storm of suck that's unlike anything else I've ever seen before or since. From the awful, ear-bleedingly amateurish production to the pure cynicism and laziness behind every composition and idea, it's just an unmitigated disaster from start to finish. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna wash out my ears with some ambient music for the rest of the night and then pick up that new BT album and get into some dance music made by people who actually know what they're doing and give a fuck. As for this album, I'm overall feeling a 1.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. But I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. If you do like this album, don't feel bad for it. That's fine. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.